Hello, everyone. I am Victoria, and on behalf of myself and Purposefully Human, I want to thank you all for joining this exciting discussion today. It's great to meet and see you all again. I hope to be guiding you guys through this great discussion along here with Felix. And just before we dive in, I want to share a little bit about the goal, about the event that we have and how we've structured it. So our mission at Purposefully Human is to create an organization or create a world where our organization embraces the complexity of what it means to be human. And that means by fostering genuine human connections. We really aim to inspire engagement and trust and meaningful change that allows individuals and organizations to thrive together. And with that being said, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how we want people to experience our webinars and in a way that specifically reflects our mission. So a key part of this is making sure that everyone feels involved and seen and engaged, which is why we've intentionally kept today's audience pretty small. We hope it creates a cozy feel, like we're sitting around a kitchen table and everyone feels comfortable sharing and contributing their thoughts. Today, we will begin with some questions for Karl Sharicz, the author and editor behind the book from his CX Pro series called Beyond the Basics: Advanced Insights for Customer Experience Professionals. Then we'll open up the floor for an interactive discussion with our audience, which we're very fortunate are some of the brilliant and contributing minds of the book we're talking about today: Lori Gray, Gary David, Mark Borst, and Jerry Seifert. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Karl Sharicz. He brings over 30 years of experience in customer experience, spanning in high-tech, manufacturing, and B2B environments. He's a recognized thought leader in customer experience management, an author, editor, and member of the Customer Experience Professionals Association, where he served on the board of directors, and so much more. Thank you so much for being here today, Karl. Is there anything else you would like to add before Felix takes over for the next portion?
Oh, I'm sure I'm going to add a whole lot of things. But that was a really good start, Victoria. Thank you very much for that. Go ahead, Felix. I'm at your disposal here.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much for having you today. And so why don't we kick this off and you tell us a little bit about what inspired you in the first place to let's say, write or edit this book. Why was it needed? What was your inspiration and your motivation to do it?
Well, okay. I hope you understand there's a long story behind this here.
Okay, let's see.
There was a lot leading up to this here. So, people ask me, how does someone with a background like yours get into customer experience in the first place? And I think there's a lot of us here, especially people my age, who can't really call it. I wanted to be a customer experience professional from the time I was 12 years old, because I didn't think anybody had the ability to say that. Maybe a few youngsters today. But it all started, I think a good story behind this. I'm a proud veteran of the United States Air Force. I served during the Vietnam era. And I think that was good preparation for me to be in the world of business. I wasn't really slated for that when I graduated from high school. I had no thoughts about college. This was the time of the draft, if you remember. And, I was subject to being called. And I did get called, but I went voluntarily into the United States Air Force. I learned a lot there. And when I got out down around 1972, I still didn't know what I was going to do. So I took a job at a company in a chemistry laboratory, of all things. And why did I do that? Well, the job interview asked me to recall elements in the periodic table. And I was able to do that. And they thought, oh, great. And they just hired me.
All right.
So very, very serendipitous there. But that led to a whole series of positions. And during that time, I actually decided, well, if I'm going to be in this business here, I better get an education in that. So I signed up for a degree program at Suffolk University, which I started right back in that time. And I graduated in what year did I graduate? 82. So from 72 to 82. So 10 years there. I went to school part-time. And during that time, I actually became an analytical chemist. So I was involved in things like spectroscopy and chromatography and nuclear magnetic resonance and things that most people don't understand. But by and large, not only did I like what I was doing, but I started getting exposure to working with customers, and that's where it started. I would do customer demonstrations. I get involved in the training of the customers because I worked for a company that was a manufacturer of analytical instrumentation. And so it was important that the customers understand how the machine could do the work for them, and then how would they operate the machine. So I was involved in both ends of that. And that kind of one thing led to another. And I, changed companies a few times in that process. And I became the director of training in an organization that I joined weeks before as a business development manager. And when I got there 2 weeks later, they said, how would you like to run the training group? And I thought, well, okay, because I'm up for anything. I'll try anything. And so I started that, and then I realized that, I really should get a degree in education if I'm going to be a director of training. So there's this, kind of thing about working and going to school at the same time. So practicing everything that I've been learning. So that worked out for me. And I finally ended up, and that was my last tenure in corporate, 17 years at a company, a fire and life safety company, where again, I went in as a business development manager, but ended up in a CX role because of my observing. There was one day that there was a town hall meeting, and the VP of service got up in front of the employee population and said, "I'm proud to announce that we have 98% customer satisfaction." And of course, bells went off in my head to think, how in the heck do you get to 98% customer satisfaction? So I thought, well, in my spare time, I'm going to do a little research. I'm going to find out, how do they determine this? And what I discovered, that they had developed a system designed to give them the results they were looking for. And then I took it upon myself to write, kind of like, if you will, an internal white paper on, this doesn't seem to make sense. And if I were doing it, I would do it this other way. I forget even what I said back then, because I really wasn't steeped in customer experience. So the person I reported to at the time took it to the senior leadership team, and they decided that let's let this guy run customer experience for us. And that's how I landed in that
move. I like this.
I mean, and here I am. I'm like, I don't know the first thing, but I've opened my big mouth, so I better start learning real fast. And part of that learning was, as you can well imagine, this is 2004, when I landed into this position. There wasn't a lot out there, for me to learn by. I mean, I started reading books. I started noticing certain conferences going on, especially ones in the Boston area that I didn't have to travel. So I attended a few of those. I think Fred Reichheld was a speaker at one of them, because he's local here. And so I just started, kind of learning wherever I could. And the other big thing that happened during that time was the Customer Experience Professionals Association that came into existence in 2011. And and I knew Bruce Temkin actually before, one of the co-founders of the CXPA. I knew him beforehand. And I just joined right into the organization. And as I like to say, I dove into the deep end of that pool. I just started taking on everything that I could. So I've done whole lots of things for them. And as you mentioned, Viktoria, I was on their board of directors, one of the original board of directors. And that was a 5-year stint before they put term limits on that. But I was there at the moments where a lot of decisions were made, including the formation of the Customer Experience Professionals Certification, CCXP. I was there, voted on that. And I actually worked for them for about 18 months as a content curator. So I was doing that. And but that last 10 years in corporate was pretty key for me. So I spent from 2004 to 2014 learning the craft of CX through any means possible. And of course, being part of the CXPA and being very curious and inquisitive led me to lots of different connections, and I learned a lot from there. And by the way, at the end of my tenure at the company I was working for, I then took their exam, their CCXP exam, passed that in 2014. So I always like to proudly say that I did that the way it was intended to be done. You do the time in the work, and you do the hands-on work and the experience that you can't learn that from a book. You can't learn that from a cram course. That's my
Very
opinion
true.
anyway.
Yeah.
So that's it. And then when I left corporate, it was a nice, sweet deal because they were offering packages to people who had been there for a long period of time, had been there 17 years, and I came under that category. And it didn't take me too long to decide that I think I've done all I can do here. I think I'd like to move on to something else, and that's what I did. In 2014, I said to myself, I'll do something different. And the difference is what led to what I'm doing today, and of course, the books leading up to that. So,
and what made you write or edit this particular book we're talking about today?
well, the thing
Why
that
was it needed?
yeah, well, there's a predecessor to that, and that is this one here. I don't know if you can see that here.
Yeah.
This one's called CX Pro, a practical guide for the new customer experience manager. So what I did is, that was myself as the sole author. The course that I developed and delivered, starting actually as a live in-person course until COVID, forced everybody into doing virtual work. It was the collection of all that experience that I had over those 10 years in the corporate. And I put that in the form of a course. And then last year, it came out in the form of a book because I kept notes, collecting notes all that time. And I figured, well, I might as well document this. So it's, it's an archive. Here's the course. One can take the course or one can read the book, or one can do both, preferably. The book is a really good companion for the course. So that was the predecessor. And the reason for the second book, which is the one you call Advanced Insights, or Beyond the Basic, Advanced Insights for Customer Experience Professionals, I felt that there was more to say, but I wasn't the only person able to or qualified to say all the things that needed to be said. So I started looking around. I pretty much picked the topics out of the book here, and I decided who best to write about that, who'd be willing to do it, who's got the right skills, the right experience, the right backgrounds to write these chapters. There were 16 chapters in the book, and I started thinking about who I wanted to write those chapters. And I had a couple of criteria in mind. I wanted somebody, obviously, that had good writing skills, and everybody here actually does. So I made sure of that. But I didn't want famous names. In the world of customer experience, there's a lot of stars and, Hollywood Star of Famers. I didn't want those names in my book. I wanted people who weren't that familiar, but obviously were just as astute and just as smart as some of the big names in CX, but somebody who needed or deserved a little bit more exposure, So I wanted to give those folks a chance to get their names in print and be able to proudly say that they contributed to chapter to this book, and that's where we are.
That's nice.
That's how really we got to everybody that we have here on this webcast today.
So, in the process of doing it and editing it and reading all the contributions, was there anything, let's say, unexpected, new, or something that even challenged your own views about people and what it means to be human?
Well, it's a really good question. And yes, absolutely. So I've written a book completely by myself. Now I've edited a book where I was the prime editor, and I self-published, and I was the sole editor of this book. So obviously I had to read each one of these chapters. Well, my first thought was, how do I get kind of a consistent tone to this book, because all people write differently and speak differently and express differently. And it was a hard job for me as an editor. I had to really kind of bite my tongue in several instances to say, if I were saying this, I might have said it differently. But I wanted everybody to it was important for for everybody to have their own voice. So I reduced my editing down to simply grammaticals, punctuation, maybe word usage here and there. But I think everybody here will attest to the fact that I changed very little of what they had originally written. And I think that really stands because in the instance of the first book, it was meant to be read from cover to cover, from beginning to end, from chapter 1 all the way to the end. This book not so. And I say it right in the beginning of the book. You know, you pick a chapter that intrigues you and go ahead and read it, because one is not dependent on the other. So I think that the realization I came to was everybody has a different voice. And I think you have a little something for everybody in there. It would be like if, because I'm into music a lot, if the rock band came out with an album, right, and all the songs started sounding similar, I might think, man, I'm kind of bored by this. But when I hear a lot of variety and different expressions, then I'm more intrigued with it. So I think that kind of adds to the intrigue of this book, to have those different voices like that. And new, I call them new and different voices, because they aren't the same names that you see all the time. Because those folks, you know, some of them, they're repetitive and they say the same things over and over again. And I want new voice, fresh voices. To me, that was my purpose behind it.
Nice. And I like this view on how diversity in the authors and in the different views produces something bigger than the sum of its parts, basically.
Yeah.
And is there, I mean, we as Purposefully Human, we're a lot about how can we make CX delivery more human, how can we contribute to more human workplaces, and so on. So kind of bringing the human back into experience in a way. And so from all the different chapters, is there any particular example that was mentioned or that you came across of being particularly human or inhuman? Are there any stories in there you want to share that illustrate one or the other?
You know, there's so many different stories in here. I mean, the chapter on storytelling, I mean, obviously is one, because that's a more human aspect. You know, even some of the more technical aspects, you know, I mean, where I'm looking at quality approaches to customer experience management, which was written by Alec Dalton, and he's a professional in the hospitality space, you know, and he can get quite, you know, technical and academic in there, but he always brings it down to the human element here. And you know, because quality control is a concept. I mean, it applies to customer experience just as well as any other place too. But he shares this, you know, from a hotel perspective here, and how, you know, all the different goals in here just have human elements to it. There's a figure in the book here called a sample quality strategy matrix for connecting with a hotel, but you can connect it to any business here. But there's a lot of that, you know, scattered throughout the book here. I think everybody, believe it or not, unbeknownst to one another, had a lot of connections in there. There was a chapter here that was written by Mark Slayton called The CX Professional as a Trusted Guide. Now, he has his Trusted Guide workshop, and, you know, that whole manner of being a trusted guide in an organization is a very humanistic element of customer experience. And, you know, I've been through his course, and it's a pretty good course. And we refer one to one another, my training to his training, but, you know, using customer experience to act. How do we take actions in the organization? There's a Ken Peterson, I'm a business partner with Question Pro, and Ken Peterson is the president of that part of the, you know, the part of the business. And I had him write a chapter about using customer experience to act, because a lot of times we find customer experiences in this theoretical, and it never gets to the point of where are we actually making decisions and doing things. And making decisions is a very human process. And you know, the other thing too, and I happened to think about this morning while I was on my walk here, we talk about customer experience, or some people talk about customer experience we have a group of people within an organization. We have a department, or we have a customer experience program. I think of programs as things that have a beginning and end, and I think of departments as things that might even create their own silos. But I like to think of it, and it's several times in the book here, it comes out as a common theme, is it's a process. And as a process, it's a thing that we can say we have this process. And a process doesn't mean it has a beginning and an end. It means something that's in place, that's working for us right now and will continue to work for us. So CX as a process, I think, is one of the other common themes that I see coming out through all the different chapters in this book.
I think that that's really interesting. And I think from my own perspective, I, in the very beginning, looked at CX more as an attitude. Yeah, and I think a lot of people who went into the CX space had this kind of vision to create better experiences for customers and at some point also for employees. So when EX basically evolved out of CX, and I think in reality, we also find quite a lot of businesses, organizations who look at it more from an efficiencies point of view and so on. And so why do you think act organizations in inhumane ways? Yeah, what is it that drives them to not creating the best experience for customers and employees? Do you see any particular reasons? Maybe also from the work you have done. I mean, you said you have been inside organizations and you must have experienced a lot of decisions and discussions firsthand about where and how to drive CX programs and processes.
Yeah. Well, somewhere earlier in my career, I worked for a company. It was when I was the director of training, and I worked for a company that began its life as a culture. So that's a very different way for an organization to start, a startup organization, to say, we're going to develop a culture first, and whatever we end up building or making as a product and offering the customers, that comes secondary. That was a very interesting 10 years of my career to be working for a company like that. And one of the things, and I think it was even in the Purposefully Human Manifesto, it talks about doing things right or doing the right thing. That was the mantra of that organization, was do the right thing. So as you know, it was interesting because when I was interviewed for that organization, I had 5 interviews. The first one was, am I technically competent? Can I do this work for this company? Yes. And the other 4 interviews were, am I a good cultural fit? Not very often would you find an organization like that. And I don't think I've necessarily found one since. But that was a startup organization. So I think it works a lot better, at least from a initiation standpoint. I mean, after a while, after the 10 years, did some of that kind of fall away and fall off the, off the wagon, as it were? Yeah, I would say so. But it was great while it lasted. Now, when I was at that corporation I mentioned for 17 years, that was a publicly held, very large, North American manufacturing organization that was very focused. And of course, being a public company, it's very focused on revenues and profitabilities. And I think that's a lot of what stands in the way of reducing or stopping in your tracks, saying, how can I look at this in a more human way here? Because they're beholden to stockholders and stakeholders alike, and it defines their behaviors a lot. And I find that to be, it's a particular struggle here. I mean, I was in that kind of position, in the position I was in that organization, to try to get and build a process like I was building at an auction within an organization that had so much focus on the bottom line. I mean, I was literally told on certain occasions, like during the end of the quarter, do not speak to the field organization. Do not. And how do you do that? How do you manage customer experience function without speaking to the operations people in the field? It was hard to do, but I managed to do it. I had to do it skunk works, right? I had to do it on the sly. So, but one of the things that comes to mind here, and I've used this time and time again in my work, is a concept called the service profit chain that came out of the late 1990s, like 1997, with 3 Harvard professors that wrote this book called The Service Profit Chain. And I used that every time I had an opportunity internally in the organization to kind of cement the idea that customer experience is part of this call it customer lifetime value, if you will. But the service profit chain started with internal service quality, followed by employee engagement. And then, so the internal service quality is what was how you built employees' engagement. So in other words, you selected the right people, you gave them the right tools, you developed their skills if they didn't already have. They made them fit for the role of employee to serve customers in order to deliver those valued services that the customers would wanted to have. So that built their experience, which in turn drove profitable growth. So I try to use that as a, and I did it actually in a cyclic fashion. I turned it into a cycle rather than a linear, because I think it's a part of what I teach is systems thinking, and it kind of fits very well in the systems thinking mold to look at it as a cycle, because it's a reinforcing cycle, because profitable growth enables you to have better internal service quality, which means better selection of employees and skills and abilities in order to drive better deliver better services, valued services that customers want to increase their experience so that you can have this profitable growth. So it was a valuable tool for me to try to give them the sense of this isn't customer experience, isn't this thing that hangs off as an appendage over here that we do every once in a while. We collect some data and we report some customer satisfaction numbers or net promoter scores or something like that. But we were actually doing work that really drives that profitable growth in a cyclic fashion, so it reinforces itself. And I was able to actually prove some of that by showing how doing what we were doing was increasing the retention, because in our business, it was all about it wasn't about the initial sale, it was about the aftermarket and how do we keep and retain customers. And you have to have a very humanistic approach when you want to retain customers. I mean, a lot of organizations are, they look at that as as long as we're filling the bucket on the top end, it doesn't matter what's leaking out the bottom. Well, it does matter because you work much harder to fill that bucket than the work required to just plug a few of those leaks.
Yeah. I like the way it's both systemic and holistic. Yeah, the approach you just described. And I just wonder, are there any other things or tools that help us help organizations recognize that being human is not just something nice to have, but actually enhancing their performance?
Well, sometimes it's hard to be a human in an organization that's not so human. And in fact, there was one point in my career where I had brought some folks in from Boston University to help people communicate better within the organization. And there was a point where we were having a session, and it was actually the human resource manager who stood up and said, I become a different person when I walk through these doors in the morning. I'm not myself. When I leave at the end of the day, when I walk out of the door, I become myself again. And I thought, what a sad commentary that is in an organization to say you can't be yourself. But I think, unfortunately, it depends on the circumstances, but there's sometimes a risk for being too much of yourself in an organization and revealing too much of yourself as opposed to what the organization wants you to be. So I think the thing that I think about is somehow there's got to be a better way to educate and coach those at the leadership in the organization that you need to think a little bit differently about this and kind of point out the benefits of where being more human can have an effect. I mean, I give you an example here. My wife's daughter just underwent surgery because she had breast cancer. And she just recently changed positions within the school that she works for. So this is in academics. And she was recommended by her physician to have 5 weeks off. But then, after 1 week, her HR told her she had to come back to work the next week because she had run out of sick time. And so there's an example of where just because you switch positions now, it reset your sick days or something like that. I think that's very unfortunate when those things happen there. But how do you how do you get the leaders in the leadership in organizations like that to look at this in a more humanistic way? Let's take this as because what I think happens is there's a lot of policy that gets thrown at this thing here. We look at the policy manual. What's the policy manual? Well, you have to have a little bit more of a human approach here to look at this outside of the policy manual. What are the circumstances? Circumstances ought to come into play here. At least that's the way I think about it. So, I mean, because she has to conform to that, and there's no choice here. But do you see what happens though? So that inhuman aspect of that may cause setbacks. We don't know yet, but we hope not.
Yeah. So you just mentioned kind of it can be risky to show up as a human at work. And I think probably a lot also of our listeners and viewers might have the same feeling. And so what do you think, or what is probably the most impactful action that someone could take to make their own organization more human without requiring permission or budget? Or is there anything that probably feels less risky to do that people could do to really have just a little bit of impact?
Yeah, I think if it is a risky thing to reveal too much of yourself at work, but okay, so there's a point of let's reveal a little more of ourselves at work. Let's do some things, when you're confronted in certain situations that are maybe frustrating to you, come up with ways of expressing that and show your human side. I would be in a meeting and somebody said something, and I might have thought, well, that's really pretty bad, and I'll go off and I'll just, kind of think to myself, that was unfortunate. But what about approaching that person as one human to another and just explaining, when I was in that meeting, when you said this, I don't know if you noticed, but I kind of shut down at that point here. And I kind of felt like that was coming, directly at me. I wanted to make sure that, just showing a human side of yourself to somebody. And those because I think I'm reading a book right now, another book. It's called Technology is Dead. That's the name of the book. But the subtitle is The Path to a More Human Future. And in that book, they talk about the rise of individualism in terms of how do we get from where we are to a more human way of being in its individual actions like that. And it's not going to be this big collective that we expect it's going to be. It's going to be small, incremental, and it's like change management. When I talk about change management within my course, I don't talk about it as this huge transformation. That's people think we're going to change the organization to become more customer centric. Yes, you probably will, but it'll take you 10 to 15 years to do that. So it's these series of incremental changes, and I think that kind of get that out of this book. Yeah. I think that's the way it happens. I mean, you look at yourself as, you can't say I can't make a difference, because you can, but don't think of it as this huge thing you have to do. It's just this small little action, small little acts, and over time, those add up, When I joined that one company that was a culture that was developed first, when I first joined the company, I noticed that employees would walk down the hallway, and if they saw anything on the carpet in the hallway, they would pick it up and dispose of it. They would take the little pieces of paper clips and throw it away. And I thought, well, that's the way that this company operates here. There's no cleaning crew that comes in here to clean the hallways. We're each responsible for, if everybody does this little bit, we're all going to end up with a pleasant workplace with a clean hallway, and we don't have to see junk in the hallway. So it's part of that. You have to actually become part of it instead of waiting for somebody else to do it. Just become part of it. So I think you can reveal little pieces of yourself at work without revealing the whole thing. You don't have to tell them a whole story of what you do in your own time. That might be something that they don't like or wouldn't do.
Yeah. No, but I like this. Both the small steps. I think that's exactly the meaning of the question. What are the little things that we can do? And also, I think there's probably sometimes a tendency to demand for something. Yeah, and demand it to be a more human workplace, for example. And I think you made it quite clear that it's always give and take. If we don't show up as humans, we can't be expected to be seen as the humans we are. Yeah. Not the subjects, but just the objects that we think of when we talk about things like human capital and so on. So maybe to finish off this first half of our conversation before we get the guests in to join the conversation and ask more questions or provide their point of view, is there anything that I didn't touch on, but you believe is really important with regard to what we are just talking about that you would like to add before I hand back to Viktoria to open up?
Well, I get a lot of questions coming at me like, what's the third book in the series?
Okay. Do you want to reveal that already?
Well, and the third book in the series may not be a book about customer experience, though. Or I shouldn't say that. I should say it a different way. There probably will be a third book in the series that'll go with the title CX Pro with some other subtitle over here. And that would be kind of like to me, I guess the concept is what's the next frontier for customer experience? Because there's a lot of talk about CX is going away. People in the positions are losing their roles, and the companies aren't, because they're not able to show that it's making a difference in the organization. So there's a lot to be said there. And I don't know at this point here whether that's a book that I write or it's a book that, like the second book, Beyond the Basics, where I get many authors involved here. But my other passion in life is music. And so in a similar vein, I have this book idea that I'm currently working on. It's called The Rock and Roll Underdogs: Hidden Gems Within the Shadows of Stardom. And this is all about those performers in the world of rock and roll that, for whatever reason, their brand did not rise to the extent that other brands did. Everybody understands the Rolling Stones and the tongue and the brand that the Rolling Stones represent. They made it big in the world of rock and roll. But there were bands just like them that started at exactly the same time as they did, that try as they may over the same number of years, 50 years, never made anywhere near what that band made. So that's what that's about, So there's this theme, I guess it started with me from years ago, as I've always been looking at and empathizing with the underdog. I always felt that like I'm giving authors in this book, Beyond the Basics, a chance to get their names out in front of an audience. I'm giving now these particular rock and roll bands, I've got 40 of them in mind. So there's going to be a book with 40 chapters, and there's a lot of work to be done here, but hopefully they'll appreciate the fact that I'm giving them some exposure after all these years. Some of them still in existence, by the way. So I'm sure they'll appreciate it. So there's this duality. So there's two book ideas I got going here.
All right, good. I was close to raising my hand to be included because my teenage band never made it. So I ended up in consulting, but
well, you know what? Perhaps you can read some of my chapters and give me some feedback. How's that?
Yes. All right, Viktoria, over to you to get our guests around the kitchen table or the fireplace.
Well, thank you, Felix, and thank you, Karl. It's lovely to hear, just your whole perspective on, and your journey throughout this whole time writing, your different books and your courses and just your experience of your whole career. And so, yeah, I want to kindly ask now the audience if they would like to turn their cameras and microphones on. We'd like to open up the floor for questions or thoughts or any observations on anything we just touched on with Karl and Felix. Is there anyone that would like to begin?
I'll be happy to kick it off.
Yeah.
Karl, I think your perspective on developing, creating customer and more broadly human-centric organizations, and the fact that everything is based off of how quickly you can get to ROI is really, really salient. Noting your mismatches that, oh, we're human-centered, we're families, we're a family here, right? You hear that a lot, but it isn't really. Do you have any thoughts on how to acculturate that kind of thinking without specifically calling it out? It's almost like the equivalent of like give the dog the medicine and put it inside the cheese kind of thing. He doesn't realize that he's getting it. Do you have any thoughts on how we could work to expand that kind of thinking across organizations without it being intentional and called out and named? Or do you disagree with that approach? We should keep it named and we should keep this customer and employee experience present?
I mean, it works best when it's integrated within the organization. I mean, I knew of one organization that I was a customer of. This is not personal, but in business, I was a customer of a company who manufactured camera equipment, security camera equipment. And my experience working with that company was astounding because what I found that they were one of the most customer-centric organizations ever to be. Probably there's no other, well, I could be. I just don't know about another organization like that. And they, in turn, it was a company, it was a privately held organization where you had that leader that understood. And to me, there's where I think one of the key issues lies right there. In fact, a colleague of mine, would say many times to me, I have no desire to work for a company in the capacity of managing customer experience unless the leadership in that company has already bought into it. I don't want to have to sell ROI up the pathway to this organization. They have to believe it. And the reason that resonates with me is I spent a couple years in sales, in a sales position. And I had a very good regional manager, by the way. He lived in Alpharetta, Georgia. Not that that means anything, but maybe they grow smart people in Alpharetta for all I know.
They do.
But he said to me, Karl, one of the basic things you need to learn is unless that client sees a need, you don't have a chance in hell of selling whatever it is, because they have to have a need. So to me, there's a big problem here of how do we develop the need in the mind of the senior leaders in an organization that they need this. I think, they think some have thought they need it because they went to a conference and they got inspired. There's, we got to hire a customer experience person now. We hired that person. We tell them go off and do their thing. But then that's it. We stop there, So I think there's a huge gap there. And if there was an opportunity to, maybe there's a need for a curriculum around that to, because I look at, there's a program out at Michigan State University, a master's program in customer experience. And Professor Tom DeWitt developed that program there. And I asked him the other day whether the folks, enrolling in that program, what's their backgrounds? Who are they? Are they customer experience people already? Or no, in some instances, he shared with me that a couple of veterinarians were enrolling in the master's program in customer experience. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. A veterinarian interested in becoming a customer experience or getting a degree in customer experience, because they were looking at how did they develop their business. Because think about it, as a veterinarian, you got to be pretty darn humanistic in that role. And I've dealt with them as a pet owner and a local veterinarian here. And it's a very humanistic thing when you're talking about a pet that has a problem or is sick or something like that, or God forbid is at that point where they need to be euthanized, you know. So I think there's a huge opportunity. I can call it a gap, but I can call it an opportunity too, to get somehow get the senior leaders a little more. I mean, go back to that service profit chain. If you believe that this is a key part of the process of the customer lifetime value over here, why wouldn't we want to then put more emphasis on that part of the business, you know, as opposed to any other part of the business, like the profitable growth is the outcome. If we do all these things right to begin with, you're going to get to that spot. You know, it's just getting there, you know, it's just stop the obsession with, and when I worked for an organization that became obsessed with even the Net Promoter Score. Oh my God, in heaven, I brought that into the organization, and I thought to myself, Karl, why did you ever bring this into the organization? Because they became so obsessed and focused on this thing that became the goal, you know. And I had we switched leaders, presidents every 2 years. And one year the president came to me and said, Karl, we need to take our Net Promoter Score and rise it up to 70. And I asked that gentleman, why do we need that? And his response to me was, well, I shop at Neiman Marcus, and I like the way that they serve customers, and they have a 70 Net Promoter Score. So therefore, we need to have a 70 Net Promoter Score. So, of course, I tried to reason with that individual to say, well, that's, you know, we're a fire and life safety business, and the business to business, that's a consumer retail. That's quite different. And I lost the argument because he was the boss, and that was the goal. And that was the goal I was given, which, of course, I was never going to make in 1 year. So there you go. That was the attitude. So it needs to change. It needs to change at that high level. I think, you know, a lot of people in CX are in push mode all the time, right? They're always pushing an agenda. I think we need to see a little more, and maybe a lot more pull from the senior leadership, so that push and pull work together. So something that they want, that they're eager to have, we are helpful to delivering, and that needs to come together. It can't be just that one-way push. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe it's too much answer.
No, it does. And I think you raise a lot of really great points there. I'll let the others have the floor. But thank you.
I'm still fixated on Karl telling me, I was just gonna say, I'm still fixated on Karl saying that I'm not popular, and that's why he asked me to be part of the book. I didn't want to let that go by. That was what I took away, is that I'm not popular or well known.
Yeah. In the CX realm. I'm not either. I consider myself an underdog. You know,
I'm offended for Jerry, though, more than myself.
Yeah. So I wanted to speak to Lori's question. We were very intentional in my organization, Lori, and we started a CX initiative from ground zero scratch. They asked me to do it. But we also had 3 cultures that we had to blend, because we acquired 2 companies after I began my initiative. And that was not a deliberate part of the CX initiative until we realized it had to be. And so, working very closely with the VP of HR, I began to work in tandem with trying to move that culture. As Karl mentioned, or referenced at least, there's so much that mitigates against it. Culture is deeply embedded, as I think most of you know. And trying to really inculcate human-to-human connections and making meaning, talking to, in my case, a furniture installer about making meaning for a client, something I did all the time. And ultimately, it started to connect, but everything else is so process-oriented, so empirical, so transactional, that it mitigates against it constantly. And in my chapter in the book, I quote perhaps the famous authors or the famous experts in CX fairly liberally around the reality of the value of human to human interaction in any business. I was in the B2B space, but So I would say that intentionality really needs to be a big piece of this if you're going to succeed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. We have time, I think, for one more suggestion to, one more topic of what we've been touching on, one more person to ask anything specifically on what we've spoken about today, and then we will probably wrap up.
I want to give the non-famous person a chance to become famous right now.
Okay.
Is that Jerry or me?
No, it's scary,
Yeah, real quick. I mean, it's just, I'm a sociologist and I work at a business school. And numerous times when I'm at an open house for prospective students, I will have a parent come to me and say, what does sociology have to do with business? And I just kind of stare at them, right? And you think about this larger conversation about human and being human. And the idea that as a sociologist, we study humans, and that's what we do. We study people in groups. And we study humanity. And the idea that it wouldn't be obvious that sociology has everything to do with business. And part of it's sociology's fault, right? In terms of how we branded ourselves and talk about ourselves. But the other part is just the larger sense of what business means in the national culture, at least in American culture, I will say. And this notion that anytime you consider people, that's soft. And in my chapter, I talk about, this fallacy that quantitative is hard data and the numbers have to speak for themselves. The numbers never speak for themselves. Numbers always have to be spoken for. And it's a rationalization to allow bad behavior to say the numbers are speaking for themselves. It's a way of separating responsibility from the actions you're taking by failing to consider adequately that there are people at the end of any decision. And so I work at a business school. I never had a business class in my life. I wanted nothing to do with business. And I've come to have a greater appreciation and understanding for people who do business, because most people want to do business well and right. But organizations and culture get in the way, as has been referenced. And so part of our job is to create, number one, provide permission for people to make decisions that include people at the center of it. Number two, if your first thing to go is your experience strategy, then you never really were about it in the first place. And so don't tell yourself the lie that we care about it when all that was really going on was something that was performative because you felt like you needed to or had to because others were doing it. And number three, there are many companies and many examples of putting people at the center, not just customers, not just employees, not just users, but people and systems at the center and having that result in wins for everybody. It's not a matter, profit is not binary. There's a range. And so if all you care about is your quote unquote maximizing profit, then ultimately, historically speaking, that's going to come at the expense of people. And so we need to consider ROI, that return beyond just quote unquote profit, and the broader return to the impact on people and society.
Well,
that's not a question.
No, I know.
No, that's okay. I mean, that was great to hear, especially just being, in this session right now. I think it's a great opportunity to have these discussions where we can share, especially with the audience that's going to listen, how important it is to place humanity at the center of all of these experiences. But as we're right now about to wrap up, I want to just take a quick moment to thank Karl and all of you who are lovely contributors to this book for joining us today and giving just such thoughtful advice and just bringing up important topics that we all need to be educating ourselves more on. And it's really just been a pleasure hosting you all. I want to thank Felix as well and Jerry for all of his guidance through all of this. And we hope to see you guys at future events. Purposefully Human, you can find us on our LinkedIn page, on our website, and this webinar, along with 5 others, will be posted on YouTube, and we'll share on those platforms that I just mentioned when it's all published and live for everyone's viewing pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Viktoria, and thank you, Felix, for inviting me to be part of this. And likewise, thank you all authors, co-authors, for being part of this as well. You all accepted the challenge and you rose to the occasion.
Thank
And
you.
you're famous. Then you're going to become famous as a result.
Viral. A lot of things can
Yeah.
be viral, including like viruses. So cuts both ways.